I guess I speak today to you as someone who's walked a journey with renewal movements and with communities associated with the Catholic fraternity. But I also speak to you now as a bishop, and really want to speak about like a perspective on the renewal movements and the Catholic fraternity in the church. So, if you like, giving an ecclesial setting to the movements. I was given a brief sabbatical, first one I'd had actually in 35 years. I got 2 months, the Cardinal gave me 2 months early this year, and I went to Rome, and it gave me a chance of doing some reflection and some writing on this question. The question that was really interesting, had interested me for some time, and that was the emergence of new movements in the church. The ones that have emerged in the last 40 years or so ones that would be relevant immediately to ourselves, but also looking at it in an historical perspective to look at the fact that the Church's history has had many movements of renewal at different points in time. But one of the things I talk about is the fact that the renewal movements in our time have a distinctive character to them, often quite different from the ways that renewal movements in the past have eventually taken expression in the Church. In the past, most renewal movements have led to the formation of religious communities, religious orders. And so we talked about St Bernard yesterday. Of course, that was quite specifically a monastic renewal movement. But you think of St Francis and so forth, that his movement of renewal, which was an evangelical movement really, eventually took expression in the formation of the Franciscan friars and the Paul Clare sisters. But in our own time, one of the distinctive features of the movements is that many of them, and I think quite significantly, a significant group of these movements are actually essentially lay movements, or what we call ecclesial movements more accurately, in the sense that they are movements that involve lay people, priests and religious. Many communities, an ecclesial community basically says that the three basic states of life in the church are all represented in the community. So this has been a particular feature of the communities in our time. So it was an effort to reflect on this. The title for the book as it stands at the present moment that I produced out of it and hope to have published later on this year is A New Wine and Fresh Skins, Ecclesial Movements in the Church. And just to give you an idea of some of the subject areas, just give you a taste of where I'm going with it. I start off by talking about the emergence of of ecclesial movements in our time, just sort of surveying it, and I try to survey it a little bit historically, but also across the world. So we look at communities in many different parts of the world. Then I look at historical precedents to try and look at the history of how movements have occurred in the history of the church. And then I try to look at the question of the defining the characteristics of ecclesial movements. What actually constitutes the nature of an ecclesial movement as we know them in the church at the present moment. And then I move on to the impact of the movements, and I look at the rebuilding of Christian life as a title. There's a section there looking at how the movements have actually gone about the process of rebuilding Christian life. Particularly I'd say that in a relationship to the secular environment in which we now live, and how that's really eroded the quality of Christian life in the church. Then I talk about ecclesial movements and new evangelisation and the whole relationship that the communities have with this task of the new evangelisation. And then I talk about the ecclesial setting of the new movements, looking at really how do they fit in relationship with the church and some of the issues related there to, relationship between a movement and a diocese, a movement and a parish, and those sorts of questions. So I'll touch a little bit on that today because I think that's a very important point. And the last thing I look at is issues of governance, particularly the question of moving from the initial founder, if you like, of the community to the next generation of leaders, because I think that's a critical thing that many of the movements are now facing. So I kind of explore that. I explored it a little bit juridically as well, looking at the canonical, if like the church law with relation to these things and so on. So it's still a work in progress. It's just being edited at the present moment, so I can't flog the book right now, but hopefully there'll be... but I present to you because I think it's written for It's written for the movements because I really think it's important to the movements, a little bit of what's happening here, look beyond just your immediate experience. Just, I'm involved with this movement. Just and look at it globally. Look at the work of God in the church today, not just in terms of how it's expressed in my particular experience, but look at it more broadly. And secondly, to build, as you're endeavouring to do here, a greater sense of interrelationship with one another and see a part of a greater work of God in the church and understand more clearly where each of us fit into that and how we can be moving with the overall work of God and not just narrowed down to our particular perspective. And the second thing I do with this work is to try to offer it to bishops and priests to give them an opportunity of being able to understand more clearly what's happening in the church and what the place and value of communities and movements can be for the life of the church. So that's what's envisaged with the work. What I'd like to do today is address the question with you a little bit of what I call the ecclesial setting for the movements, because I would like to offer you just a chance of some simple reflection on where do communities fit in the church? How do we understand the relationship between the communities? And firstly, the broad nature of being Catholic. Matteo touched on that, I think, very wonderfully last night, and I'd like to explore that a bit. I think critical to this, as I've reflected upon and looked at it, I think critical to this is the question of the ecclesiology. That's the theology of the church, how we understand the nature of the church, and the impact of the Second Vatican Council on the ecclesiology of the ecclesiology. Because the more I look at it, the more I think really the Second Vatican Council was very providential because it really laid an ecclesial framework for the emergence of, and more importantly, the acceptance of new movements in our time. I don't think we should ever underestimate that, because it is true that many movements have had struggles to find their place and recognition and appreciation of how they fit into the church and church's history. And I think a foundation was laid in the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council that really enabled communities to almost, not quite seamlessly, but really be able to move into the church and as Matteo was saying last night, to really move to the very centre and heart of the church. And there was an ecclesiology, there was an understanding of the nature of the church that really has enabled this to take place, and we shouldn't underestimate that. I'd like to point out four things. I'll try and move through them fairly quickly. The first thing, the one that we're very familiar with, and this is familiar territory in a way, but I want to see it to appreciate how significant it has been for what has actually happened subsequent to the council. It wasn't so much the council addressing movements. The council addressed the question of the church, and the fathers reflected on the nature of the church, but then spoke about the church in quite new and fresh ways that actually enabled what happened subsequently to be embraced readily and easily. The first thing is the notion of the church as the people of God. As you know, you're very familiar with that title. What it simply says is it puts the emphasis on the people and the dignity of each single member of the church. It moves away from a top-down notion of the church, the hierarchy, then move down to the laity. This new paradigm really presents the notion of a people of God, that the church is made up of each person with their own particular contribution and dignity and place within the church. And so, for instance, in the new Code of Canon Law that came out in 1983, I like to quote this very often because it says in the code that the right of association among members of the church does not depend on the hierarchy, but it is the right of every baptised member. It actually, before there was the idea that almost the hierarchy would mandate somebody to do something, but now it's saying no, every person has a right to do it.